The Competition Commission has released a provisional report on the impact of digital platforms on traditional media. Among its findings, the regulator has found that Google enjoys a monopoly and an unequal bargaining position of the South African media. According to the report, there hasn't been an equitable share of value between Google and local news publishers, both historically and currently, and that is in some ways affecting advertising revenue. It's also found that the majority of South African consumers use social media as their primary news source. Let's discuss this and perhaps the implications and bring in Reggy Moalusi, who's the Executive Director of the South African National Editors Forum and joins us now via our video link. Reggy, great to see you. Thanks as always for making time for the SABC. Quite an important inquiry this was, and hopefully the findings don't gather dust in some report but have consequence. Let me just begin with what I think is necessary context. The advent of social media dramatically changing how people consume content and news more specifically. I suppose the question this inquiry was trying to answer is whether or not there is fair play in that changed landscape.
No, absolutely. Good morning to your viewers, Ayanda. Good morning to you as well. Absolutely, that's what the inquiry was trying to do here. Remember, just to go back a little bit, we approached the Competition Commission with other advocacy organizations and media houses in 2023, and primarily because of that, because, you know, news content is produced by us as the news media, as the industry, and what big tech platforms have been doing, they've been using this content, and they've been using it for free. So the fair play on the commercial side of things, we approached them to say, this cannot be. We need an inquiry and we need the Competition Commission to have a look at this, hence the inquiry.
Sure. In many ways, part of what this inquiry has found is that these big tech companies are riding off the coattails of traditional media. You know, traditional media, for example, does the groundwork, and what these platforms are able to do is just to really repeat some of that information and make money off of it.
Absolutely. And these platforms, you must bear in mind, they don't have any journalists. They don't have any journalists that go out, gather the news, and then produce the news for audiences. Those journalists, they need to be paid salaries and all of that. But I mean, what we have seen, particularly with these platforms and our industry in South Africa, is that over the past few years, the number of journalists that we have in South Africa has halved. We now have more and more journalists that are unemployed because we have seen media houses closing, we have seen titles closing, we have seen the current media houses that are there struggling to keep afloat and struggling to pay those salaries and to keep journalists, whether permanent, whether freelancers or on contract. So that's exactly what we are saying. We are saying to the Competition Commission, we appreciate the provisional report that has been released. We're going to look at it. They've given us, I think, about 6 weeks or so, and then we'll revert. We'll go back to respond to the provisional report, and hopefully by the time the last final report goes out later in the year, it will be a report that continues to find in our favor. And the big tech platforms, we are hopeful that they can come on board and say, look, let's sit down and have an adult conversation, so to speak.
And we'll speak about what that conversation perhaps looks like. I find it interesting that there's been an amount that's been said, for example, for Google to try to compensate journalism. Firstly, where does that money go if, in fact, Google agrees to pay? And are you in agreement with the quantum? I think it's about between 300 and 500 million rand.
Look, the Competition Commission did try to explain the quantum, but the matter of the quantum will get to that, because I think that quantum, they are looking at the recent years. But me and you, Ayanda, will know that a business like Google has been in South Africa for a number of years. And I'm talking, I mean, what, maybe 20, 25 years? So what about those other years? Because that's when the damage, we started to see the damage that these guys have been doing, and they are failure to acknowledge the damage that was being done. So that quantum, it's a quantum that's been suggested to Google. We'll see how they respond to that, but it's a quantum that we have never, we haven't said that we agree to that quantum or not. It's a quantum that we can always look into, and the Competition Commission, I'm sure they'll be willing to come on board as mediator between us and them, and we'll hopefully find a middle ground, because if you look at South African media landscape, that quantum is meant to cover whether you're talking digital, broadcast, or print. It's a huge media landscape. There are small and big players. So how are you going to distribute that, and who's going to distribute that, and how are you going to fairly distribute that among all players?
Yeah, absolutely, which was my other question, right? Who handles that money and who decides how ultimately it's spent? But SANEF has always spoken about a sustainability fund in an attempt, I suppose, to try and plug the gaps where they exist. How much momentum is that initiative receiving? And I'm, thinking out loud, wondering to what extent that could form part of the solution.
Look, before the Competition Commission even mentioned the idea of the fund yesterday, we have already started with the fund. We are moving at great speed in terms of launching that fund. We have engaged several key players such as the business community in South Africa, and we will be launching that fund. It's a fund that we have always said it can help in terms of the sustainability of the industry. It can help in terms of sustaining jobs across our media landscape, seeing more journalists on the ground and covering the South African story. So that fund is quite key. We have moved with the fund. We were happy yesterday to hear the Competition Commission in one of their recommendations mentioning the fund, which we will, happily embrace and take it from there.
Sure. What this moment does, though, Reggie, is help us to really reflect on what I think has been a long-standing issue in journalism, generally speaking, the world over. And that's about, the funding model generally to keep the industry afloat. I know there's been all manner of panel discussions about whether or not the current model in the advent of social media makes sense given the decimation that the industry has suffered. And from your perspective as SANEF, are you getting a sense that we're making any headway in coming up with a different model that might work for our times?
I think so. I think we are on par with colleagues from across the world. I mean, it's a global question what you are asking, and it's a question that no media house, no journalist or CEO can wake up and say, here's the answer. And I think I found a silver bullet to resolve all our problems. We are not there yet, but I think the funding model, what we know at the moment is that the old conservative funding model, for instance, of relying on traditional advertising is out of the window. We need to look at other ways. We need to look at other revenue models. We need to look at how else can we do business. And we need to share notes, not only in South Africa, not only across the continent, but globally, to say we know that journalism is not dying, but importantly, journalists need to be paid. We need the revenues. We need to sustain the businesses. So that's the conversation we are having. The conversation has to do with this funding that we want to come up with, the solution for that. What is it and how are we going to do it if we are saying the traditional funding model of advertising is out of the window? Then what else do we come up with?
Speaking of sharing notes, I wonder if there are other countries in the world that have mastered this relationship between big tech and traditional media, especially because, of course, we know what Google has done to our industry here is not unique because unlike South Africa's journalism industry, Google works across borders, including X and many of these other digital platforms.
Absolutely. I mean, there was an agreement in Australia. There was an agreement in Canada. But as you may know, when you read up on those are as well suffering at the moment. They are facing their own problems. So fortunately, the Competition Commission is aware of that, to say the lessons learned. And for us, hence there was a broad scope. And that broad scope to say, seemingly we don't have the one solution that where Google has worked and where they are in one agreement to say this is how we can coexist and this is how we can co-function with the news media, and the acknowledgement that there's the news media, and the news media, we are using their content as it is, as Google. So that solution is not there. And we were looking at the Canada model, we were looking at the Australian model. They started off well, but as time went by, we are now realizing the challenges. And hopefully here in South Africa, what we have done can be can lead the way across the continent, across the world. SANEF has launched this, and the whole world and our media colleagues across the globe have been asking, what's the progress? Because we want to see what kind of notes we can take from there and what kind of lessons we can learn from the whole process.